to our wonderful hymn. Our wonderful hymn. Wow. Now we are going to turn to God's Word, and you should have received in with your bulletin a little insert. It's got the story of the biblical character Joseph, which takes up chapters 37 through 50 in the book of Genesis. And so it's a long, drawn-out narrative of the family of Jacob, or Israel, because his name was changed to Israel along the way, and his 12 sons. And his 12 sons, the names of his 12 sons became the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And every time I say that, I feel like I need to clarify that just a little bit, because if you look it up, it's not precisely correct, because what happens is that his one son Levi, who became the tribe from which the priests were taken, they kind of dropped out of the naming list because they didn't have a parcel of land. And then Joseph's two sons were added to the list, supplying one name for Joseph and then one for Levi, so that there'd be 12 again. So that's the full story, but it's basically the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the story is in chapters 37 through 50, and I didn't think that you wanted me to read, 14 chapters, but the most important part of the story for our purposes this morning comes from chapter 45, which is sort of at the end of the story, but not quite yet. There's a little epilogue at the end of Genesis that tells the rest of the story, so to speak. But in Genesis 45, there's an incredible section in which Joseph is revealing himself to his brothers, and those of you who know the story know that that would make Joseph's brothers not only feel guilty, but they might feel afraid that Joseph was going to get revenge on them, because they had threatened to kill him, almost did kill him, but instead sold him into slavery in Egypt. And Joseph's take on that situation is much different from the understanding that his brothers might have. And this is what Joseph says about that. What's the best word? I was going to say horrible, but that's not quite the word. The untoward occurrence that happened to Joseph of being sold into Egypt, being in prison in Egypt eventually, and then getting out, which our story will go forward in a minute. Here's what Joseph has to say about the whole story. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." In other words, this was all part of God's plan. "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors." He's talking about his own family there, that his family was going to survive because of this. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. That's a whole, in fact, if you lined up what the brothers might have thought and lined that up against what Joseph said was the truth of what had happened, they'd be totally opposite. Totally opposite. But Joseph is saying this is and has been God's will for our family and for a whole region of the earth in that Middle Eastern area where the famine had hit. It's truly, truly amazing. Now, the title for the message today is Only You, with a question mark. It's in the bulletin. And that's on purpose. That wasn't a typo. Because what we're going to think about today is how God uses some people in a particular situation, and in some ways they were the only person that God had to use in that situation, or had put in the position to be used in that situation. And I think that's true of Joseph particularly, which is our guy today. Now, before we get to that, right? A little bit before we get to that, God is always at work. Okay? God is always at work. So most of the time, the situation is that God is working, and then he calls people to join with him in the work that he is doing. Okay? So it's not like, oh, God is waiting to get these people working and then he can get this job done. No, God's already working on that job. He's giving you the opportunity to join him in that work. I mean, you can see it in the gospel account. He's going by the Sea of Galilee, right? And he sees Peter and Andrew in a boat, for they were fishermen, and he says, hey, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Well, he's got the agenda. Jesus has the agenda already. He's just saying, hey, if you want to get in on this, come follow me. And he does that. I mean, in the Gospel of Luke, where he calls Levi, it's the tax collector. He's sitting at his tax collecting booth. He's got a job. It's not a really nice job, but he's got a job. And Jesus says, hey, come follow me, and you'll get in on all the good stuff, the good work. They call it good news. That's what gospel means. That Jesus comes teaching and bringing God's good news. But I think it is true that on occasion, at least, and that's what I want to put before you all today, on occasion, there is a certain instance in which it's like the situation is made for this person, or can only be resolved by this person, not just anybody who follows Jesus, or anybody who follows the Lord, or is a follower of God, but that sometimes it's just the one person that's necessary. And it might, here's the punchline, it might be you. It might be you. Now, I want to give you a few examples of that, just to show you I didn't dream this up last night, okay? I'll give you a few Bible examples, first of all, okay, other than Joseph, all right? How How about Moses? Another big guy in the Old Testament, right? Okay, so Moses was the leader of God's people. He led them out of Egypt through the wilderness desert to the promised land. He was about the only guy that had the training for that. Now think about it. Okay, this is Moses now. Moses was going to be killed because they were killing the Hebrew babies because Pharaoh in Egypt thought they were getting too strong. Okay, so when Moses was born, his mother hid him in the Nile, in the bulrushes, to protect him from that. And it just happened that the princess of Egypt came and said, oh, there's a beautiful little Hebrew baby. I'm taking him back to the palace. And, you know, God's got all the arrangements fixed around, but because who came to nurse Moses when he was an infant? His mother. Yes, of course, his mother. Because his sister ran and told the mother, oh, they've taken Moses to the palace. And she came to the palace and was the nursemaid for her own son. Amazing. So for the first 40 years of his life, he grew up in the Egyptian palace. He was familiar with Pharaoh. He was familiar with the way of life of the king of Egypt. He was familiar with all that kind of stuff. Then he got in a little scuffle, trouble, okay? And he had to flee Egypt. And he spent 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness. So he's got 40 years of training in Egypt, 40 years of training in the wilderness, and then there's just an incredible scene in the scriptures where God comes and says, Moses, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's the substance. Moses, I got a job for you. And Moses gives 5 reasons why, no, Lord, that's not me. It's not me. Don't, get somebody else. Anybody. In fact, he comes down to, I used to get anybody else. And God says, are you kidding? No, you're the guy. He doesn't say this exactly, but he said, you got the training with the Egyptians, you got the training in the wilderness. That's the 2 qualifications, unique qualifications for this job. You're the man. And if God was taking note of my sermon, you're the man, only you. You're the only one. Okay, that's one instance. Second instance, Queen Esther. Okay, and I know Esther is probably not the book that you read first when you started reading through the Bible or whatever. Maybe you skipped over it when you. Esther was taken into the harem of the king of Persia. She was a Jew. But while she was in the harem, there was a bad guy. There was a bad guy in the king's court, and he wanted to kill all the Jews. And he persuaded the king to kill all the Jews. And it was on the schedule. It was on the schedule. There was going to be a pogrom. That's the official name. The pogrom was going to begin on a certain day, and Mordecai, who's kind of one of the heroes of the book of Esther, Mordecai is the uncle of Esther, and he says to Esther, Esther, the only person that can stop this is the king. But nobody can get in to see the king. And Esther says, well, I can't go in and see the king either. He just calls for me when it's my day to be the person to go in and be with him. And Mordecai says, you've got to go because this is set. You've got to go before that. You can't leave it to chance. You've got to ask the king if you can see him. And she does. And she does. And she persuades the king of Persia that this is unfair to kill the Jews, and it changes the whole scene. It changes the whole scene. But she was the only one that could possibly get in to see the king and save her people. She was it. That was the only one. You know, this was such a good story that it was about 10 years ago, maybe. Every time I say 10 years ago, my wife says, no, that was like 15 or 20 years ago. Anyway, whatever years ago it was, they made a movie of it. Such a great story called One Night with the King. She got in to see the king. She asked to get off the schedule and to get in that night, and she persuaded the king to save the Jews. One night with the king. Okay, now I'm back around to Joseph. I proved that it happens more than once. Okay? So Joseph I didn't mean to look over there because I'm going to talk about sibling rivalry, but anyway.
Plenty of that.
I had a brother too, so don't worry about it. And I told them last week about the time I tried to bite my brother's leg and lost a tooth in his overalls, so don't worry about it. So there was terrible sibling rivalry with Joseph and his brother. And, you probably should have said, you might have said, well, Joseph should have been more careful. He didn't have to, and Jacob should have been more careful. I mean, Jacob clearly is part of the problem because he favored Joseph and Benjamin over the other boys because Joseph and Benjamin were sons of his favorite wife, Rachel. And he gave him, my coat doesn't qualify, but he gave him the coat of many colors, or depending on the translation that you believe, or the coat that had long sleeves, one of the two. And I noticed that in the recent translation in the NIV says they have resolved that conflict between whether it's a coat of many colors or a coat with long sleeves, because the Hebrew is unclear. That's the problem. The Hebrew is unclear. So they have resolved it by saying he gave Joseph an ornate coat. Okay, so it was fancy, in other words. Fancy coat. And all the boys said, well, where's our coat? Nah, they didn't get one. Then Joseph says, hey, I had a dream. Yeah, and the guys are saying, well, what was it? And he says, well, we were out shocking, the grain, and, there was one sheaf of grain that stood up in the middle of things, and then there were 11 around it that bowed down to the one sheaf. Oh, you think you're a big guy, right? We're going to bow down to you. Then, even worse, he says, I had another dream, and, here were the sun and the moon and the stars, and they all kind of were bowing down to me. And even the father says, hey, wait a minute now, you're crossing the line here. You think your mother and I are going to bow down to you? But if you read carefully in that section of Genesis, it says, but Jacob started thinking about that. He started pondering what was going on. And then, of course, the rest of the story is on your handout sheet, where the boys got so upset with their brother that they were going to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, thought, that's not a good idea. So he said, well, let's throw him in a pit. in a cistern or a dry well. And then Reuben was going to come back, we think. The scripture says Reuben was going to come back, get him out, take him home. He didn't want to see anything that terrible happen to him. But in the meantime, Reuben's out of the picture, and they sell him into slavery in Egypt by selling him to a tribe of traders, Midianites, going down to Egypt with a bunch of stuff. And he goes down into Egypt, and I don't want you to miss this part, and particularly you people that have been coming to Sunday school, because the promises to Abraham, which y'all have been studying, right? The promises to Abraham were to have descendants and a land and to be blessed and to be a blessing to others. Everywhere Joseph went, he was a blessing to others. They prospered. He goes to work for this guy named Potiphar. Potiphar doesn't have to do anything. In fact, it says, all that Potiphar worried about was, what are we having for supper? He didn't have to worry about any of the business, any of the household affairs, anything. Joseph took care of it all, and it all went well. But Potiphar's wife noticed that Joseph was a really handsome guy. And she started making advances toward him. And he says to her, this isn't right. Said, I manage all your husband's affairs, and, I'm not going to violate my oath to him to be a good servant. I'm not going to violate that oath by trying to go behind his back to mess around with you. Well, she finally can't stand it any longer, and one day she grabs his cloak. Now, I don't think this is the coat of many colors. This is the usual one he wore in Egypt, okay? She grabs that, and he runs out of the house to keep from being compromised. He runs out of the house, and then she lies to her husband. That guy came in here, and he was about to get me, and I screamed, ah! That wasn't really how it was. But her husband, at some level, has to believe her, and so he throws Joseph in jail. Joseph spends years in jail. Well, who prospers from that? The jail. He took over for the jail. Joseph took over for the jail, and everything went smooth again, because everything Joseph touched went well. Okay. So he was the only person. He was the only person because he got out of jail and became the right-hand man to Pharaoh. And he was the only person who could save his family. He was the only person who could save people from the famine, the people of Egypt. And you know the plan. He had barns built, and during the good years, they saved up grain. 20% of the grain they saved up. Then they had that to eat. And that's what got his brothers down to Egypt, because they were starving back home. So he was the only one that could have done that. It's amazing. He was in the right place at the right time with the right God, and he saved his family, and he saved lots of other people too. A blessing. You know, one of Jacob's sons was a blessing to others. Now, we're almost finished. What I need you to think about is where might you be the only one the only one who can bring God's blessing to somebody else. Because it's not just that it happens in the Bible. Okay? And I'm gonna give you just a couple of brief examples of people who had that position, that unique position to bless others, and saw that and did it. Okay? So the first person that I have in mind is my own father. Okay? And my father passed away from cancer a long, long, long time ago in 1970. I was only 20 years old at the time. But my father was the oldest in his generation of the family. He had 5 brothers and sisters. Okay? But he was the oldest, so he felt a particular responsibility for his family. And before his death, and he was only 57 when he died, before his death, he helped to settle my grandfather's estate, my grandfather's brother's estate, my grandfather's sister's estate, the estate of a lady that lived with my father's aunt, and he helped with 2 or 3 other estates that had to be settled, cleaning up the things that surround a person's death, getting their affairs in order, making sure that things were done fairly. And there was no one else in our family that was going to do that, and I never heard my father say, oh, I wish I didn't have to do this, or, I just don't like this. No. At some level, my father recognized that he was the one. It was only him to help his own family. He had a relationship with a lawyer that added to that. My father was actually the manager of a private cemetery. I grew up in the cemetery. But that relationship with the lawyer comes into the story because in West Virginia, to settle an estate, they would appoint a local lawyer to help you. So Dad had a good relationship with this lady lawyer that he knew, and he would always wait until it was her turn to help with the estate, and then they would work together to settle all these estates. But do you see, there wasn't anybody else. There wasn't anybody else that was going to do that. Now, but it's not, well, let's take family first. There's some of you who might be the person in your family that is the only one that can do the work that the Lord needs to do with somebody in your family. I mean, it might be as simple as you're the mother or you're the father and it's your children. Your children aren't going to get the same lessons at Sunday school, or at least not with the same impact. They're not going to get the same lessons that they get if they come from you as the mother or the father. That's a unique position. That's a unique position that you might have with your kids or your grandchildren. Yeah, I'm old enough to have grandchildren even. Just kidding. I'm really old enough to have grandchildren. And we have We have 6 grandchildren in our family. I have 2 kids. My wife and I have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. And we have 6 grandchildren. My wife poured her life into those 2 children that we had, and now she's pouring her life into the 6 grandchildren. Because she sees that that's a unique position.